Hello and welcome. Will the final results in Afghanistan's recent elections really make any difference? The country remains in limbo 2 weeks since voters went to the polls, risking attacks by the Taliban. Thousands of reports of election misconduct, several hundred serious enough to sway the actual vote, were filed with the Electoral Complaints Commission. For any candidate to avoid a runoff, they must reach 50% plus one vote. As of now, the incumbent president, Hamid Karzai, is approaching that mark. Although his closest challenger, the former foreign minister Abdullah, is crying foul. His supporters have been gathering in Kabul to voice their concerns over irregularities in the vote. Meanwhile, the violence in the country has surged significantly following the election. 2009 was already set to be the deadliest year for foreign troops since the campaign against the Taliban began. And then, following a series of recent attacks, a suicide attack on a mosque on Wednesday killed Afghanistan's Deputy Chief of Intelligence, along with 22 others. On today's show, we look at the implications of Afghanistan's elections as violence surges and ask, does the outcome of the vote really matter to everyday Afghans? And is there any hope for stability? Remember, you can join our conversation with your questions and comments. Log on to livestation.com/AJE. You can enter the chat room and then take part. We'll also welcome your phone calls onto the show. Joining me now from San Francisco is Tamim Ansari, an Afghan-American author whose works reflect on his own experiences in a bicultural world. His most recent book is the best-selling Destiny Disrupted, a history of the world through Islamic eyes. From Stanford University in California, we have Dr. Robert Cruz, an assistant professor of history there and co-author of The Taliban and the Crisis of Afghanistan. And here in Washington, D.C. is Halima Karzai, an Afghan-American activist who works to advance and bring awareness of the rights of women in the Muslim world. Previously, she was Director of Foreign Policy at the Independent Women's Forum. I want to welcome you all to the show.
Thank you.
Thank you. And Tamim Ansari, if I could start with you there in San Francisco and ask, reports of massive fraud, low voter turnout, refugees unable to vote. When it comes down to it, what real difference do you think this vote is going to make for Afghanistan?
Well, for one thing, I think that, the first vote that was 5 years ago took forward the actual process of democracy, and this vote has set it back. I think you have to ask, in a situation where the government itself doesn't have any real control of the country, what difference does it make who has control of the government? I think that's the big question. I think over these last 7 years, the big mistake has been on the part of the United States to look at the Afghan situation as a war, which conceives of it as two sides and the mission being to defeat an enemy, instead of thinking of it as a case of a society that has been shattered and fragmented, and therefore the mission would be to reconstruct and put it back together and make it whole. And right now, I think this process of democracy, this election process, is setting back the ultimate goal.
Let me ask you, Mr. Ansari, it looks like Hamid Karzai is in the strongest position so far, but with the reports of allegations of fraud, it looks like Mr. Karzai may be pressured to accept a runoff. What is the likelihood of that and him accepting that too, and what will that do?
Well, I should think that the runoff will be even messier than the election itself. And it's an ironic situation because I've read a lot of reports that show that there was tons of fraud in southern and eastern Afghanistan. People who had previously said wholesale a village was going to vote for Dr. Abdullah ended up, the ballot boxes came back and every single one of them was marked for Karzai. On the other hand, the South and the East is the area in which Karzai would have been strong and where voter turnout was suppressed by Taliban threats. So, the whole situation is ironic because if there was no violence, then probably Karzai would have taken, that part of the country.
Dr. Robert Cruz, if I could bring you in here, sir. Now, some UN officials have said off the record that the worst possible thing could be a second round of voting because the voter turnout would be even lower. Now, is that because those in Afghanistan, the voters, are perhaps complacent about it or perhaps getting apathetic about it, or is it just fear of the Taliban?
I think more important, the experience of this actual round of the first round of voting would demonstrate that the government, in fact, is unaccountable to their wishes. The extent of fraud was so widespread that I think the lesson from those who actually attempted to defy the Taliban and turn up is that their voices, in fact, do not matter. We have cases of ballot boxes being filled in advance of the election. People appeared in the morning to vote and were turned away saying that all the ballots were already in place. So in effect, the Karzai administration and the other actors to a more limited degree basically created an election which I think devalued the voices of Afghan citizens, and it seems unlikely that they will take these risks again when they are likely to be once again marginalized.
Right. Dr. Cruz, do you think that that devaluation of the election is to the extent that the actual result could be tainted, I mean severely tainted by the alleged fraud?
I think the result is clearly tainted, and I think it's a major question for the Obama administration and indeed for the United Nations. What should be done about this? I think as with the Bush administration in 2004, the Obama administration needed this election. They needed to go into the midterm elections of 2010, pointing to some kind of foreign policy success in Afghanistan. And as General McChrystal rethinks American strategy, he is contemplating, of course, sending more troops. And for an already reluctant American public to get on board, the United States, I think, wants to see real democratic progress there. Unfortunately, giving a green light to this electoral outcome will only, in a sense, defraud both the Afghan and American publics.
Thank you. Well, Halima Karzai, it's good to have you here as well, joining me in the studio. Judging by what our previous two guests have said, it doesn't look very good in terms of what Afghanistan has tried to achieve in this election. What's your perspective on this? Was it a vote that just really has spoiled the image of the country and spoiled the prospects of a free and fair movement forward with democratic values?
No, I think that the past, since 2004, the elections, of course, did not have the same turnout, but we also have to remember that Afghanistan is still a nascent democracy. This is the country's second election. And so to have the perception that Afghanistan would have a flawless election is completely unrealistic.
Now, the extent of the alleged fraud and the way the vote was perhaps tainted, when you say it's still early days, would you have expected something better this time around?
Considering that the country is still in a state of war, I mean, there were rockets being thrown and people were still coming out and voting. I think the election and the people who actually came out to vote took exceptional steps, and they came out, and it was a way to show that they were still ready for change and that they were hopeful for change.
Let me put a question we got through email to you, if I may. It came from here in Maryland, in the USA. Robert Freeman wrote in saying, "The outcome may not matter to Afghans struggling to survive, but it does matter in the eyes of the world. The election must be free and fair, or the Afghan government and the US will look bad." Do you think that sentiment applies at all?
The elections definitely matter to the Afghan people. If it didn't matter to the Afghan people, they would not have gone out to vote, even considering that the country is still in a state of war and there were threats being put out against people who were even thinking about coming out to vote. And it's more important for the Afghan people than it is for the international community, because it's the Afghan people who continue to suffer. It's the Afghan people who are becoming or who are falling prey to the effects of what's going on, and their voices are not being heard.
If I could bring in Tamim Ansari here again, the fact that Afghan refugees, and there's such a large number of them, were unable to vote must have played a fair a role in the outcome, or at least the potential outcome. Could anything have been done to try to accommodate the Afghan refugees far better than they were?
Well, I can't really speak to that because I live here and I don't know what the conditions are exactly over there. I do want to say, however, that this focus on elections as being equivalent to democracy, elections are very important, but there's a great deal to democracy underneath of elections that isn't in place in Afghanistan. The rule of law, the idea of security, the being able to speak about whatever you want, access to libraries, all these different things. All of that is part of building a democracy, and it all has to go forward together. Elections is just the last stage of democracy.
Well, Dr. Cruz, Hamid Karzai effectively fell from grace from with the Western allies in more recent terms. What do you think the allies there, particularly the US, would like to have seen happen in this election? And do you think that, they say there's no favorite in this process on their side, but do you think that is the case?
I think in the end, I think that the outgoing Bush administration leveled very harsh criticism at Karzai and really tried to create distance between Washington and Karzai's government in Kabul. But when Obama's administration came into power, they in effect stalled some of this criticism. They pulled their punches to a degree. They made some decisions that I think conveyed to many Afghans that Karzai was still the incumbent figure whom Washington most supported. So in the end, I think Washington's claims of neutrality should not be taken at face value. In fact, though he did not receive the support of 2004, nonetheless, I think Washington backed Karzai and still probably will back Karzai, and is clearly not crying foul about this election to the extent that Washington probably should. And this, I think, should be read as tacit support for Karzai and his incumbency.
We're going to look at more issues coming up in a moment. We have to take a short break now. As we pause, let me remind you can join the conversation with your questions and comments by logging on to livestation.com and entering the chat room. There's a debate taking place in there right now. And we'll be right back.